to the preliminary round of the 2012 World Schools Debating Championships. I'd like to quickly explain to you how the format of these debates work. Each speaker in the respective teams will have 8 minutes to make their speech. After the first minute, the timekeeper will signal once, like this. After this, the debaters on the other team may offer points of information to the speakers. Debaters must stand up when they offer the point of information, and the speaker may choose to accept or decline the point when it is offered. At 7 minutes, the timekeeper will again signal once. After this, no more points of information may be offered for the rest of the speech. At 8 minutes, the timekeeper will make a double signal. And after this time, the speaker must conclude within a few seconds, or we will signal until they stop. There will be a short break between each speech for the judges to complete their notes. And after the 6 main speeches, each team will have an opportunity to make a 4-minute reply speech. This can be done by either the first or the second speaker of each team. No points of information are allowed during reply speeches, and the opposition will make their reply speech first. Before the debate begins, I'd like to remind you to please put off your cell phones and anything else that might distract the debaters. Should you leave or enter the room for any reason during the debate, until the end of the speech to do so. Finally, audience members cannot participate in the debate. There will be an opportunity when the debate is over to comment to the debaters. So before we begin, I'd like to introduce you to the judges. They are Taimur Bandi from Pakistan, Lakshmi Ravindran from and Ariana Curry from Greece. In the proposition debate, we have the team from his. The first speaker is Ayelet Mulman. Is Idan Fast. And the third speaker is Miriam Kalman. In opposition, we have the team from the first speaker is Michael Macklin. And the second speaker is Bryn Guthrie. And the third speaker is Emma Pottinger. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome the first speaker from the proposition to open the debate.
Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, we would like to thank South Africa and the school for their kind hospitality in this championship. Now, we on Science Proposition believe that parents have the right to raise their child, and that this is what's best for their child. Today I'll be speaking about the harms to the child, and why it's better for the child himself to be raised by the parents. My second speaker, Idan, will be explaining about the harm to the parent, and why we think it is illegitimate to take away the parent's right to parent. First of all, let's take a look at what we're actually talking about today. We're talking about people who have committed non-violent crimes, because in the cases of violent crimes, we take away a child. In a case where there's violent crimes, a parent doesn't have the right to retain guardianship over the child nevertheless. We're talking about a child who will not be restricted to the prison. They're allowed to leave the prison, sort of normal situation. They're not confined to the prison. We're talking about having a different ward for these people. We don't want them mixing with terrible criminals, but thank you. We're talking about having a social worker to make sure that everything's okay, to make sure the parent is not abusing or neglecting the child, to check in on the situation every month or so, something of that sort.
Sorry, ma'am.
No, thank you, sir. And we'd like to have that social worker explain to the parent beforehand that this is the situation, what will happen when they take their child to prison, so that they can make a truly informed decision. So now let's move on to my point, parenting, and why it's better for the child to be raised with their parents.
Sorry, ma'am.
thank you, sir. Generally, in status quo, we give parents the right over their children because we believe that parents know what's best for their children and can make the best choices for their children. There are two reasons for this: the biological imperative and the knowledge of a child. So first of all, the biological imperative. As we all know, a parent has an inherent and immediate biological connection to the child from when they're born. All the hormones do this, it's basic biology. Because of this, parents love and care for their child. They want what's best for the child. They want to send their child to a good school, they want their child to have good friends, to enjoy life, to have good stuff, thank you ma'am, etc. For this reason, we know that they'll strive to do what's best for their child. And how do we know that they will indeed do what's best for their child? Because they have the knowledge of their child. They know their child well. They raise them from age 0. They know what's best for them. They know what they want. They know how they respond to different situations, etc. Because of this, in status quo, we give the parents the right over the child to make decisions for their children, to decide what school to send them to, decide where, etc.
We believe that any parent that would willingly subject their child to the brutality and punishment of prison is not a parent who we think is able to parent their child.
Okay, I'll be further explaining about the prison situation and why we think this isn't a terrible situation. And because a parent knows what's best for their child, we assume that if they take them into prison with them, they're knowledgeable of the situation and they're making sure that what they're doing is best for their child. We believe that there is an inherent connection, there is a connection between children and parents. The children need their parents. They need that emotional connection, and the parents will do what's best for their child and help their child. So no, yes, there are certain circumstances in which we do take away parents' right to the child, in which we do take children away from their parents. What are these situations? Abuse and neglect. Those are the only situations in which we take a child away from their parents. So what is abuse? Abuse can be either physical or emotional. Physical abuse is causing great physical harm to a child. If a prisoner does this to a child, if one of the parents we're talking about does this to a child, causes great physical harm to them, then yes, clearly we will take the child away. But we're talking about the normal situation in which a parent won't physically abuse the child. Emotional abuse means literally causing a child to be emotionally dysfunctional, to not be able to function properly in society. Telling your child he's a complete failure is not enough to be considered abuse in today's status quo. And neglect is not providing a child with the basic needs that they need. Not providing them with school, not providing them with food, etc. Now, we would apply these same criterion in prison. If a parent in prison abuses their child or neglects their child, yes, we will take away the child. But team opposition in this debate has to prove that parents in prison are inherently neglecting or abusing their children, and only in this circumstance can they win this debate. No, thank you, on your own time. So now, why does a parent in prison not apply to these criteria? So let's take a look at the situation we're talking about. We're talking about Joe Schmo, who's a single parent, loves his child very much, cares for him, and what can we do? He evaded his taxes, or he embezzled, or he stole a loaf of bread, which we all think are bad things, no thank you. But that doesn't mean Joe doesn't care about his child. It doesn't mean he won't take care of his child and do what's absolutely best for him. He still cares for them. So we'd like to hear from team opposition why they think that this is inherently abuse.
Sorry, no?
No, thank you, sir. Stealing a loaf of bread does not cause a parent to not love their child, does not cause a parent to not want what's best for the child, and does not cause a parent to not do what's best, to not care for the child and strive for their best furtherance. No, thank you. And as to neglect, in prison, the framework exists. It's practically impossible for a parent to neglect their child in prison, because in prison there's an existing framework. There's your schooling, there is food, there's a social worker to make sure everything's fine. So in this situation, I don't think this is even something we really need to worry about. And yes, we accept that prison is a harsh place. We accept that this isn't the ideal place to grow up. None of us would like to live in prison. But so is Harlem. So are many places. And because a child is being raised in an unideal surrounding, in not the best place, that doesn't mean we need to take them away from their parents. I'll take you in a moment. that this situation is similar to being raised in a poor neighborhood, where yeah, you have a small apartment, yes, you're surrounded in crime, and nevertheless, we believe that the parents can do what's best for the child and take care of them, yes.
Don't you think a parent that commits a crime that unruly harms their child by committing this crime, that's abuse, that's the neglect you're talking about?
No. If a parent steals a loaf of bread, if a parent embezzles, they're not trying to cause their child harm. This is a situation, an action that is separate from their child. And the fact that they steal a loaf of bread doesn't inherently cause harm to their child. So we see this situation as analogous to other situations in which we do not take away the parents' right to the child, in which we still believe that the parents are going to do what's best for the child. And so we'd love to hear from team opposition why they suddenly think that in this specific situation, we suddenly have to change everything. In this specific situation, we have to take away a parent's right over the child. We have to forcibly separate a child from the person who loves them most. So ladies and gentlemen, because we believe that a parent knows what's best for the child and wants what's best for the child and will take good care of the child, and because we know that prison doesn't inherently mean abuse, doesn't inherently mean neglect, and of course we agree that in cases of abuse and neglect we should take away the child. We're talking about a case-by-case thing. We need to have this case-by-case. So because of these reasons, I beg you to vote.
Just before the next speaker, I'd like to tell you something that I omitted in the beginning. The motion for this debate, for those in the audience, is that this House would allow single parents in prison to raise their children from behind bars. I apologize for not noting that earlier. I thank the first proposition for her speech, and I'd like to call on Michael Macklin to open the case for the opposition.
The crimes of the father beget not punishment of the son. That's the line Teams of Africa bring to you today. However, before I get into my speech, we would like to ask Israel why they're copping out. They haven't effectively defined this motion. They haven't actually argued for the right of parents to raise their children behind bars. The model we were given by Israel was that kids won't be in prison, kids will live in the outside world, kids will visit their parents, kids will have social workers looking after them and ensuring that they have some sort of functioning interaction with their parents. That is the status quo. That is not raising your child behind bars. We have a number of questions. Under their model, if these parents are raising the kids, where do they sleep? Where do they eat? Who clothes them? If they're living with other family members, why don't we just let them live with other family members? Basically, we weren't given any good reason by Israel as to why children should be forced to live behind bars with their parents. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a model. The model that they have to defend in this debate is that children will in some form live in prison. And whether it's in a separate wing of the prison, where they actually do live with their parents and are raised by their parents, we're happy to debate about that. But it's a fundamentally different thing to what they were arguing for in the substantive matter. Before I get on to my 2 points of explicit rebuttal, let me give you my case split and first of all my clash. What is best for children not living in prison? In terms of my case split, I'm going to be speaking to you about, first of all, the true nature of parents and children. And I'm going to prove it to you that neither of them deserve to have children in prison. Secondly, the nature of prisons, something that was glossed over by Israel to their detriment. Prisons are horrific places which are not fit at all for children. Thirdly, I'm going to be speaking about the actual development of a child, what it needs, and why prison isn't the place to allow for that. And finally speaking to you about the government mandate to favor children over their parents. And in order to do that, they cannot allow them to live in religion. My second speaker, Britain, is going to be speaking about the role of the judiciary and how Israel's model, what the model should be, undermines the judiciary's capacity to fulfill their key role in society. 2 points of explicit rebuttal. All parents care for their children because of the biological imperative. Why then are 16,000 children raped by their parents in Spain? Why then are there reports of hundreds of thousands of domestic abuse by fathers against their daughters in the United States of America? Why then, in South Africa, do we have some of the highest incidences of father-on-son violence in the world? Parents don't always take care for their children. The reasons why they don't care about the feelings or physical welfare of their children don't matter. If your parent cannot provide for you, if your parent poses a threat to you, we do not allow you to raise them. We shouldn't allow you to raise them. No thank you. Secondly, this broad assertion that Harlem in New York City is essentially the same as a prison, and therefore we let these people keep their kids. Why can't we let prisons? A, these people haven't committed a crime. They haven't waived all the freedoms that we grant people in society, which, if allowed, would allow criminals to pose a direct threat to that society. That's the primary premise of a prison. That's why Harlem isn't the same. That's why Soweto isn't the same. That's why Khayelitsha isn't the same. Now onto my positive matter. Let's look at the actual nature of these parents, the actual nature of these criminals. And we can see that there are two types in a moment. You have sort of major criminal offenders who can spend a long time in prison, and then you have people who steal loaves of bread and are only going to spend a couple of weeks in prison. Okay, the point being that the law views these two same individuals and society views these individuals the same. They are criminals. They are unfit to live in society. We put them in prison in order, as I've already touched on, to remove all those freedoms which allow them to pose a risk to that society or to explicit individuals in that society. That's why in prison we don't allow you free movement, because then you can attack someone, but we do allow you the vote. We very carefully choose the sort of freedoms which prisoners are allowed. Children are individuals. Children being forced to live in a prison, which I'm going to be touching on later, a horrific condition which poses direct threats to their safety, but more fundamentally in this debate, to their development. We don't understand why these criminals should be allowed this freedom when it doesn't meet the criteria of all other freedoms that we do allow to prisoners. Why are children individuals? Why aren't they?
Sir, we clearly explained in our definition that these children will be in prison with their parents in a separate ward from all the other criminals.
Okay, best case scenario, they're denied interaction with the outside world. They're denied interaction with other children.
Sir.
They're denied meaningful interaction with the rest of society, and that's just as much a direct threat to their development. On the nature of the children, they are innocent, they are vulnerable, and they're ripe for development. Why are we locking them up, seeing as Israel now arguing on the model they should be arguing on? Why are they forcing them to live in a ward when they haven't done anything to be constrained in that ward? Why don't they deserve free movement? Why should they be forced to live in this environment? But now we need to look at the needs of a child, because we're speaking about in this debate all the way from infants who are being reared by their mothers, all the way to raising your children. So in theory, up to the age of 18. What are the needs of you and I, the members of the audience? We see that we need consistent care, which takes an incredible amount of time and dedication. But more than this, we're incredibly resource hungry. We need special food when we're infants. We need special health care up until about 15. More than this, we have very specific education needs, which aren't the same as those of an adult. This is important when we then contrast this with the nature of a prison. They're overcrowded, they're undersupplied, and they're not designed to care for children. The sort of healthcare provided in prisons is A, inadequate in the vast majority of the developing world, but it's specifically even if it was adequate to provide for adults, not for children. They're populated by the worst of the worst, even if we're denying them all access. I've already touched on why that's unacceptable. But now we need to look finally, having moved on to this, onto the development of a child. Now, why does locking a child in prison in a special ward where the only person they're ever going to speak to is their mother, why is that fundamentally detrimental to the development of a child? In a moment. Well, I'm going to be proving to you that there are 5 harms associated with this. 1, the negative influence of only being exposed to one person when that person is a criminal. 2, the lack of exposure, I've already said in a moment, to general society and how that affects the development of a child. 3, while we undermine the safety of a child under either policy Israel wants to talk about. 4, while we perpetuate the cycle of recriminalization and therefore poverty. And 5, while we further societal stigma against the children of criminals. Yes?
Just because they're living with their parents, once again we said they'd be allowed allowed out to go to school, for instance, and other such things.
Okay, they're out to go to school, they're out to interact with society. So are they being raised behind bars or aren't they? What we want to know is, if they are allowed free access to the rest of the world, what is the difference from that and the status quo? What is the difference between that and foster care? That's why you cannot hold on to that line. Okay, we believe that considering children are innocent and vulnerable, and they're young and easily influenced, surrounding them by criminals is going to indelibly impact on the sorts of values those children pick up. Values society has told us aren't right. 2, we believe limited exposure to the outside world is a bad thing when you're a child, because development of this crucial social capacity is what happens when you're a child. You need to interact with your peers, you need to interact with the rest of society, so you know how to deal with them. The fact that homeschool children find it incredibly difficult to integrate with normal society or open society is evidence to the fact that denying children exposure is incredibly harmful to their development. Thirdly, safety. We still think that all criminals are on some level a danger to society, and they're just as much a danger to these children. We're either having no exposure, we are having exposure. Finally, we need to look at the fact that 50% of criminals in the developing world 50% of criminals in the developing world recommit. The point is,
Somebody timing them?
Last time it was 8:05 and in fact now.
So you can't give them 15 seconds.
yeah, assuming it was 8:05. The point is, ladies and gentlemen, the prison environment is that not which we should be exposing children to. Secondly, these parents have flouted their rights and their obligations to society, and they no longer deserve to have access to their children. Thank you.
Sorry, Ken.
It's 8, but I asked them not to clap after.
Is it 8?
The margin, they can speak after 8, but not to clap after.
Thank the first opposition speaker for his speech, and now to continue the case for the proposition, I call upon Idan Pass.
Ladies and gentlemen, before I start, I'd like just to clarify what open order really was, because apparently the opposition did not understand it. We're talking about A, parents that have committed non-violent crimes. B, we're talking about living in prison and having the ability to move in and out freely. And as the opposition contested that this is actually considered living in prison, we see no difference within this definition and actually living inside a house. You live inside the house, you sleep there, you can freely go in and out. This is a completely reasonable definition, and we still stand by it. 3, this is in a different word, as we specified. And 4, a social worker would always be available to check that there isn't any cases of abuse or neglect. Second thing they say, they have analyzed they have given us several things on why this prison is not the best place to raise a child. Now, before I start explaining why this is actually not true, I'd like to explain that they have missed the burden of proof. Ladies and gentlemen, we only revoke the right to parenting in 2 cases: abuse or neglect. The fact that there is a better alternative to raising a child is by itself insufficient to revoke the right to parenting. As an example, although Cape Town is a much more awesome city than Johannesburg, we don't revoke the right of parents in Johannesburg to raise children because there's a better alternative in Cape Town. Okay? This just isn't enough. And as we've explained, and they have they have accepted that there really is no difference between a very bad neighborhood, just like Harlem, and prison. And then later, they claim that there are differences, and this is what they said the differences: social exposure and safety. To the first, social exposure. Ladies and gentlemen, the child can still go out and in, can still interact with society. Just the mere fact that the parent lives in prison, the actual place where the child sleeps in, and the bed exists in prison, does not mean that you're cut off from the outside world. You still have got interaction with the outside world, just like a child living inside a house. That sleep there is not constrained to stay in the house. Second is safety. Ladies and gentlemen, we define this as non-violent crimes. You know what? A parent that has committed embezzlement cannot embezzle a child. The mere fact that a parent has committed a non-violent crime does not mean that he's more likely to beat up his child. And you know what? If a parent beats up his child in prison, this is abuse, and we're going to take the child away, because this is status quo, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so after I explained that, that gave us 3 different reasons why prison is not a good place to grow a child with. That is overcrowded, undersupplied, and unfit to children. So the thing is, they did not explain why prison is unfit to children, which is the 3rd criteria. They just claim that it is overcrowded and undersupplied. Now, look, living in India is overcrowded and undersupplied, and we still let Indian parents have children. The mere fact that it's overcrowded and undersupplied is in itself not a sufficient reason to revoke that right. Above that, we think that if we've got a different word, why we provide that infrastructure, and we promise those parents to provide basic infrastructure that would allow them to live in a decent environment, proves in itself that it's not going to be overcrowded and undersupplied. Okay, no thank you. Now after I explain that, let me get to my constructive material, which is why counter-parenting and when we punish people. So, the opposition agreed that we only revoke the people's rights when they breach the social contract. And if you commit a crime and you breach the social contract, then we revoke your freedom of movement. We put you inside prison. But, and this is a very big but, it is crucial that the only rights that we revoke are those that are critical to that process to prevent you from committing a crime again. Ladies and gentlemen, I can give you 3 examples of that. First, detaining suspects is limited by time, because we know that we can't just revoke your freedom of movement just because we want to. It is crucial that we limit it by time. 2, even though you're a degenerate criminal, cops still put their hand over your head when they shove you inside a squad car, because we will not revoke your right to bodily integrity just because you committed a crime. And third, you need a warrant to make a search, because all these things, because we limit and we always try to have the minimum harm to the rights of the suspect or the prisoner when we try to punish him. Because we always try to minimize that harm, it is crucial that we suspect each right we revoke on a case-to-case basis. And we need to look at each right, whether it is really crucial or not. Now, the opposition has missed that burden of proof. They need to prove today why the fact that you are a parent, says that you're more likely to commit a crime, or that the fact that it is legitimate to revoke the prisoner's right to parenting, because it does not fall under the criteria that this is inherent to the process of punishment, ladies and gentlemen. And only if the opposition not prove it today are going to prove exactly the opposite. You're going to prove, you know what, it is even better for a prisoner to raise a child than not to. And let's see. First, we say that we don't revoke rights that are beneficial to the prisoner. So we don't revoke the prisoner's rights to vote, or to educate themselves in prison, or to invest in stocks. So even if it's a positive right, we still possess it. So let's say you've got a child in prison. Now, I think they all agree that the best that parents would like to raise their children and care for their best interests. And if they don't, then we revoke the right to parent the child. So let's assume they do. So you've got a child in prison. Now, I remind you that raising a child in itself is a good reason to behave well. It's a good reason to be a good role model. We're going to say that prison has another incentive, and that is called good behavior. And the fact is, in prison, you've got now 2 incentives to behave well. A, you behave well because you want to get out quicker, and B, now you've got a child. You want to have a good role model to be,
So you're using these children as some kind of therapeutic puppy to ensure that the population...
No, as we've explained in the first speaker, we explained what is beneficial and not harmful to the child. B, the fact is that we can revoke their right to parenting because it is an abuse and neglect. C, their biological parents, as we've proved, are better inherently because they are their parents and they know what's best. And D, right now I'm referring to the rights of the prisoner rather than to the rights of the child. Now thank you. So, now you've got two incentives, as I've shown you, to behave well because you want to get out quicker, and to behave well because you need to be a good role model for your child, ladies and gentlemen. And this, we say, is an even better way to rehabilitate, which is one of the main purposes we put people in jail. Now, so as we've shown you, the myth that not only do we not want to revoke the right to parenting because it isn't inherent to the punishment process, but it is even helpful to the punishment process. So if anything, it is even preferable and it is helpful to the rehabilitation process that prisoners will raise children, ladies and gentlemen. So what have I shown you today? First I've clarified what our model is. Then I explained why they have missed the first burden of proof and why social exposure and safety do not equate to abuse or neglect. And third, I've shown you why the rationale of parenting said that we cannot, the rationale of punishment said that we cannot revoke any right that isn't inherent to the punishment process. So for these reasons, ladies and gentlemen, I beg you to propose the motion. Thank you very much.
I thank the second proposition speaker for his speech, and now to continue the case for the opposition, I call upon Brenda.
Ladies and gentlemen, we find it ironic that the proposition claims that we haven't fulfilled our burden of proof, when what we needed to hear from them was a clear problem with the status quo, further than the fact that it doesn't meet the criteria of abuse or neglect. We needed them to outline to us why it's so fundamentally harmful for children to be raised by extended family members or to be raised in orphanages which are government funded, which receive subsidies. We needed them to tell us why we can't revoke certain freedoms which do actually inherently go towards the kind of crimes these people have committed in terms of punishment when we do it all the time. We haven't seen proposition sufficiently fulfilling their burden in terms of telling us what's actually wrong with the status quo. All we've heard from them is a cop-out about how we can focus on parents, how we can use children basically as therapeutic puppies to ensure better behavior within prisons. We heard from the second speaker about an incentive to get out of jail, about an incentive to behave well. We'd say these kind of incentives exist anyway, even when the children aren't in prison with them, because they want to get out of jail to see their children. We don't think that setting a good example to them now is as fundamentally important as getting out of jail to see their children. We think that's the kind of incentive that is more powerful than the one that proposition was speaking about. More than this though, in terms of my positive matter, I'm going to be looking at the role of the judicial system and how we undermine its ability to fulfill its purpose. Before I get onto it though, I have two issues of explicit rebuttal. Firstly, in terms of the model that we were given by side proposition. Firstly, they told us about the types of crimes that they will be speaking about. So, non-violent crimes or things like stealing a loaf of bread. We'd ask, why is it necessary to have your child in jail with you for a couple of months if all you did was steal a loaf of bread? Why are the harms to that child's development so fundamental that they can't be fixed when the person gets out of jail in a couple of months' time. More than this, if we were simply looking at non-violent crimes, so things like fraud, we'd say that we still think we have issues with their model in terms of separate wards and in terms of interaction with the outside society. Why is this? Firstly, in terms of separate wards, we'd say that they needed to do punishment analysis about how they can give people with children special treatment simply because they have children. How they can allow them to interact in wards that are removed from the rest of the jail simply because they have a child. More than this, we say it's unfair to the other criminals who simply don't have children. I'm going to be looking at this more in my positive matter. But lastly, in terms of interaction with the outside world, we think this is fundamentally dangerous for the security of any prison. We think that any prison is irresponsible to allow people in and out freely. More than this, we'd ask them who is going to pay for the schooling of their children, who is going to pay for the food of their children in a system that is already strained, in a system that is already struggling to cater for the people who are in jail. They needed to tell us this. Second piece of rebuttal, in terms of care for children. As I told you before, we'd ask them who's going to pay for them, how they're going to provide, but more than this in terms of neglect and abuse, we'd say that the system itself, jail itself, abuses these children. Why is this? It's because we think it's a harsh environment where they're exposed to the kind of individuals that we don't want people interacting with, even if it's through a glass screen. More than this, we say that it's government neglecting their children because they're not going to allow for the kind of access to needs that these children actually have. Simply because they're undersupplied, simply because we think that it's harming individuals. More than this, they asked us to tell you why punishment should be fit to crimes that isn't inherently in the nature of that punishment. We'd say that the reason we don't allow children is because of the kind of influence that the parents and the environment can have on them. It's the same reason why we remove prisoners from society, because of the kind of dangerous influence or effect that they can have on the society around them. We think they have the same kind of influence on their own children. We think it's dangerous for these children to be living in these prisoners. More than this though, we think it's harmful. We think it creates a stigma where already children of prisoners are seen as different, and now they're definitely seen as different because they're living in the prisons themselves. More than this, we think we desensitize them to the harms of jail, the nature of jail. That's dangerous for the judicial process and the way it works in terms of a disincentive. And that leads me on very nicely to my positive matter, looking at the judiciary. Now, when we look at the role of the judiciary, we think that they have a very specific mandate to fulfill. They have three pillars specifically which we think are important in terms of punishment, in terms of rehabilitation, in terms of restitution, and all three of these are undermined by side propositions policy. Why is this? It's because when we look at the first pillar in terms of punishment, we think that the judiciary should be using the law as an interpretation of punishment, rather than using the social backgrounds of these people to interpret the kind of punishment they should be receiving. That's why we still send poor people to jail, even though they may have stolen because they were desperate. We think it's the same principle. More than this though, we think having your child in prison constitutes special treatment. In a moment, seeing your child constitutes special treatment, and being able to use the special facilities constitutes special treatment. The kind of treatment that they haven't justified under their own punishment analysis. We think that it undermines justice that is meant to make people in jail feel bad. It's meant to make their lives hard in the hope that they're not going to commit a similar crime again. We don't like undignified conditions, but we also don't think we should be rewarding them simply because they have a child. Go.
Could you please explain why in the process of punishment we need to revoke the right to parenting rather than every upward right that we allow?
We think that the right to parenting in this situation is a luxury which can be upheld by other institutions, and more than this, the right to parent in a prison is fundamentally harmful to the child itself and to the system, which is what I'm looking at right now. So let's get back to the second idea in terms of rehabilitation. I've already told you that we're basically rewarding prisoners who have children. We say that all this does is antagonize other prisoners, create the kind of conflict that hurts rehabilitation in these prisons. More than this, we say that when there's already a strain on resources, you're adding an extra strain. When you add this extra strain, it means you have to take away from existing mechanisms for things like rehabilitation. This means that we're going to decrease the kind of education for parents, the kind of rehab that they receive. We think that it's going to increase the number of people who are likely to reoffend in a country or a situation where we already see over 50% of criminals reoffending when they're released anyway. Lastly, in terms of restitution, we think you should be paying for the crimes that you've committed, specifically for your victims. At the moment, what Proposition is doing is saying that prison is a place that is fit for children. It's saying that it's a place where children can live happily. We think that this isn't the kind of image we want to be promoting of a prison system which is supposed to be punishing people, holding them accountable, simply because we want the victims of crime to buy into the system, which protects them when they're most vulnerable. But more than this, because we think the idea that prison is awful is a deterrent which is important for the system to function to minimize the harm. What we needed to hear from them is analysis as to why. It's more than why. This is worse. Needed to hear analysis as to why they can undermine the rights of the child, undermine the ability of the judiciary to do their job, and they simply haven't. Thank you.
I thank the second opposition speaker for his speech. And now to continue the case for the proposition, I call upon Murray Keller.
Team opposition have really missed the point of this debate. They really needed to show us how prisons are so harsh, they're so different,